So it's time for our next festival edition. Little video here. It's time. Shavuot. Shavuot is upon us again. Shavuot is connected to the Christian observance of Pentecost. Pentecost always falling on a Sunday. Shavuot always drifting on a lunar calendar, so they're not connected in date, but connected to the same happenstance, the same season. And in the biblical, the gospel, the record of Acts, the same exact event and date. So I think in our last video, we just talked generally about what Shavuot is and how we celebrate it as a family. We talked about that. Shavuot is, biblically speaking, the celebration of the harvest, the spring harvest, which ends up being the wheat harvest. The harvest begins with the barley harvest. So you have the harvest of first fruits, which is the barley harvest. It's going to be the early. And then those weeks after that is going to be the wheat harvest. And the wheat harvest is what culminates with Shavuot. And so as Torah speaks of Shavuot, the festival of weeks is sometimes what your Bible will call it. That festival of weeks is really the culmination of that wheat harvest. It's a celebration of God's provision. And that's what God commanded in Torah. Now after that, Jewish tradition looked at it and said, okay, Shavuot was also the day when we got the law from Mount Sinai. Like if you look at the record in Torah and the story of the Exodus, it is on their way out of, crossing the Red Sea. They take 40 days to get down to the desert or to get down to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, they're there 10 days later. So 50 days after their, I may have that backwards now that I say that out loud. They may get to Sinai and spend 40 days at Sinai. Anyway, there's 40 and there's 10 for a cumulative 50 days. And it's those 50 days, it's when they get the law that would have landed on Shavuot. And so in the Jewish tradition, they say not only are we going to celebrate the wheat harvest, but we're also going to celebrate the giving of Torah. And so even though that's not specified in Torah, Shavuot also becomes the celebration of the giving of Torah. And that's there as well. And so, which is helpful because we don't live in an agri-centric culture. Most of us don't have fields that we're farming or a wheat harvest that we're bringing into the barn. And so there's still this element of observance there that still works. And so we talked about how there's usually, for our family, there's a big feast. We have a big party because we're celebrating God's goodness. And then you stay up that evening. You stay up all evening studying Torah. And there's all kinds of beautiful things. I'm sure we'll talk more about little nuances of that and beautiful teachings that come with that in years to come as we do our Shavuot study here on our Festival Edition series. But lots of stuff to talk about there. I've had some beautiful experiences over the last decade studying all night on Shavuot, staying up, doing all that kind of stuff, just beautiful things. I always love looking at Chabad.org. I'll link that as I always do in the description. I love listening to Rabbi Fohrman on AlephBeta and his team. They put together some great videos every year. I'm looking forward to see what they put out this year for a teaching, a video, a series, a class, a course, studying Shavuot. That'll be awesome, and I love that. But they already have some incredible courses and videos and studies. If I find anything in particular, I'll link it in the description. I love that. I love doing that every holiday, every festival. But there's just some dynamite teachings, really heady, deep stuff that they have on Shavuot, and I love that. This year, though, I wanted to just briefly kind of zoom in and focus on this idea of the wheat harvest and the celebration. So we always have, we go all out. We have a great meal the night of Shavuot as a family, a party. We usually get something really nice. We have great food. We got great drink. We usually smoke something on the smoker and just have a wonderful dinner. But there's also an element of generosity. There's also an element of extra hospitality, above and beyond, more than usual hospitality that's connected to Shavuot, and I wanted to talk a little bit about why that is. So the harvest is connected to this principle of uncut corners. So when you harvest, according to the book of Leviticus, you're not supposed to cut the corners. If you were to harvest your wheat field, you grow wheat, and it comes time for the wheat harvest, and now you're going to go out to and your field isn't large. We're not talking about acres and acres and acres of field. We're talking about a small field for you and your family. And it's time to go out and harvest your family's wheat. Leviticus 19 says this. It also says this in Leviticus 23, but I'll read from Leviticus 19:9, 9 and 10. So Leviticus 19:9 and 10, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So God says when it comes time for the harvest, whether it's the barley harvest, the wheat harvest, the grape harvest, no matter what your harvest is, I don't want you to make sure you've gotten everything. I don't want you to go over your olive trees a second time. I don't want you to go all over your grapevines a second time. I don't want you to harvest every last square inch of your field. I want you to leave the edges. I want you to leave the corners of your field uncut and unharvested so that the poor, the alien, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, and the poor amongst you, Leviticus 19 says, they can come in and harvest some for themselves, which is a lesson in and of itself, and I don't want to dwell there, but it's this principle of uncut corners. It's this principle that the harvest isn't just for me. When I go to the harvest, I'm reaping, right? The work that I've put in, and there's this like self-satisfaction that I've done all this hard work, and I'm seeing God's blessing, and now I'm reaping the blessing from God because of my hard work. We've worked together, and now there's a harvest. And God says, but make sure it's not just about you and God and your partnership. Make sure it includes others. Make sure that when you're harvesting, you're not just owning this as like, well, it's my work and what I've done. Share what you have with others. Share it. So as you celebrate the harvest, don't just celebrate it for you, but make sure a part of your celebration is in giving and being hospitable and being generous. One of the stories that we read during Shavuot is the book of Ruth, the book of Ruth. And what is the book of Ruth about? It's about this foreigner about a family that they move to Moab. They go through unbelievable tragedy. While they're there, they marry. They have these Moabite daughters that marry into the family. They're the sons of Naomi, marry Moabite women. Orpah being one of their names, Ruth being the other. And then she loses her husband. She loses her sons. She goes through all of this tragedy. So it's just her and Orpah and Naomi. And I'll link the description to the podcast episode where we talk about Ruth. That'll be in the description of the video. But she links. She has her and these daughters. She tells them to go back home because she doesn't have any way to fend for them, to take care of them, to get them husbands. They're now widows. If they go, she's going to go back home to Israel. But if they go back home, they're Moabite women. They're literally widows. They are in large sense orphans, and they are literally foreigners. Naomi says, I don't have anything to offer you. You are going to be on the margins of society, so you need to stay here in Moab. Well, Orpah does. She does stay in Moab, but Ruth says, no, I'm going with you. And so the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth, is a story of these unbelievable women of faithfulness, women of righteousness, trusting the story, trusting God, going back home, and then luckily there are people back home who are also righteous, and they're also following God's way. And so the whole story of Ruth is about this. That whole story of Ruth is about Leviticus 19. It's about Boaz, we say Boaz, who has left the corners of his field uncut. It's during Shavuot, it's during the barley and the wheat harvest. It's this springtime season, and he's left his corners uncut. He's telling his harvesters to leave some of the, he says, pull out whole sheaves and leave. He's being generous. He's being hospitable. He's taking care of the alien and the orphan and the widow. She's a foreigner. She's poor, and he's taking care of her. And this whole story where he falls in love with this foreigner, this Moabitess, and chooses not to just take her on as a concubine, but chooses to marry her, to bring her completely into the family. And this ends up becoming David's grandmother. Like, what? The King David, it ends up being in the genealogy of Jesus. Like, this story, this formative story, is all about the harvest and generosity and hospitality. Like, if you've been watching our Kingdom series, the YouTube series on Kingdom that I've been doing, what have we been talking about the Kingdom of God? Hospitality, generosity. Hospitality, generosity. This is what the story is all about. This is what Shavuot is all about. Which, by the way, when you read about the New Testament Shavuot, we say Pentecost. When you're in the story of Acts, chapter 2, and you're reading the story of Pentecost, they're at the temple celebrating this festival. So they're celebrating the spring harvest and the giving of Torah, right? And if you remember the story of the giving of Torah, Moses comes back down the mountain and they're worshiping the golden calf. So he breaks the tablets. There's a plague that kills a bunch of people, and they end up killing 3,000 people in this story because of the golden calf. When you read the story of Pentecost, you have a redemption of that Sinai story where they got the law. There's a redemption of this story because 3,000 people are saved. In the first story, 3,000 people are killed. In the second story, 3,000 people come to God's narrative. They come to trust the story. Like, what a beautiful redemption. But then there's this other piece. It's not just a celebration of the giving of the law and a new kingdom and a new way of living and a new temple being opened up. There's also another... What was the other story? It's the story of the harvest, and it's a story of generosity, and it's a story... So how does the story of Pentecost end? Well, you know, many of you probably know the passage, Acts 2, 42 through 47. All the believers were of one mind, and they met every day in the temple courts, and they met in people's homes, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to breaking of bread and prayer, and they shared all their possessions. There's a generosity, there's a sharing, because that's what Shavuot, that's what Pentecost is all about. I had a teacher, and he said, his name was Ray, and he said, we were sitting on the steps in Jerusalem where the story of Pentecost happened. And he said, you know, if in your community of Jesus, you don't have generosity and sharing, if there's no cut corners in your celebration, if there's no extra for others, if there's no generosity, what you have isn't Pentecost. I don't care how many of you are speaking in tongues. And I just love that statement. And that's nothing against the expression of speaking of tongues or miraculous gifts. It is an expression of what's supposed to be most true of Pentecost. What's supposed to be most true in our celebration of the harvest is not only recognizing what God has done for us, but also sharing that in a literal material sense, sharing that gift and that story with others around us. And so part of what we'll do every year for Shavuot is try to give an extra gift, an extra donation, to invite others into our space, to share our food, to share our joy, to share the party with others, because that's what Shavuot is all about. That's what Torah is all about. If we're celebrating the giving of Torah, what does all of Torah hinge upon? For those of us that follow Jesus, to love God with all of our heart, our soul, and our might, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is always what the story is about. And so just a reminder as we get to Pentecost and we celebrate, whatever it might be in our Christian spaces. We celebrate the giving of the Spirit. We celebrate the opening of the church. Make sure that underneath it all, the Spirit was given so that we could bless the rest of the world. The church was open so that it could be a blessing machine and share the resurrected Christ with everyone else. Don't forget the uncut corners. All right? Hope you have a great holiday, a great Shavuot, a great Pentecost. We'll look forward to the next one when the fall festivals get here this fall, and we'll look forward to talking more at Rosh Hashanah. All right? We'll talk to you then.